Since this is the very first episode of this series, a brief introduction is warranted. H.P. Lovecraft is one of my favorite authors. He has been highly influential in the popular culture, including video games. However, when I went looking to learn more about his influence in video games, I found the available sources to be scattered, fragmentary, and lacking the audio-visual component that is so necessary to video games. Well, I like Lovecraft, I like video games, and I like making videos. So, here we are. Enjoy. What does one of the best JRPGs, nay games of all time, have to do with, quote, the 20th century's greatest practitioner of the classic horror tale? Let's find out. H.P. Lovecraft, born 1890, died 1937, was an American author best known for his work in the horror and science fiction genres with The Call of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, and The Color Out of Space serving as some of his most well-known stories. Chrono Trigger was a JRPG released by then Squaresoft in 1995 for the Super Nintendo and is considered amongst the best games for its console, genre, and decade. But how do Lovecraft and Chrono Trigger intersect? There are quite a few shared elements and themes. Most, if not all, were almost certainly developed independent of any direct influence. Though Lovecraft was beginning to wax strong again in the 1990s, it seems unlikely that the 1930s author, American author no less, would be having much of an influence in 1990s Japan. Regardless of how or why the parallels exist, they do exist, so let's start with the most overtly Lovecraftian element and the driving force behind the game's plot, Lavos. What is Lavos? The heroes of Chrono Trigger, after numerous time travel adventures, eventually discover that Lavos is an extraterrestrial being who crashed onto Earth 65 million years in the past. After impact, Lavos immediately burrowed deep inside the planet. Eventually, in the year 1999, Lavos emerges from below to destroy most life on Earth. By 2300 AD, the Earth is gripped by an unceasing winter, humanity is nearly extinct, and the spawn of Lavos can be found roaming the landscape. In here, we understand Lavos' simple goal, reproduction. Quote, now I understand. It lives on a planet for as long as possible, stealing away the most vital resources. It combined the DNA it found here with its own, and gave birth to those creatures on Death Peak. Eventually, the young must migrate to other planets, to repeat the cycle. Whenever people talk about Lovecraft and Chrono Trigger, comparisons between Lavos and perhaps Lovecraft's best-known creation, Cthulhu, arise. While similar, there's an even more apt counterpart to Lavos, the titular creature from The Color Out of Space. Consider the following. Both fall out of the sky, impacting the Earth as meteorites. Both move from the surface to reside below ground. In Lavos' case, deep underground, and in the Color's case, at the bottom of a well. They have the same goal. Use the life forms of the planet to aid in reproduction. Lavos absorbs the DNA of life forms, the Color absorbs the life energy of people and animals around the farmstead where it lands. At first, everyone seemed more tired than normal, but eventually the surviving family members figure it out. Sucking the life out of everything. Must have got strong on Xenos. He was a big boy, full of life. The Color and Lavos both leave lasting damage in their wakes. Upon landing on Earth, Lavos causes an ice age that, among other things, destroys the dinosaur civilization. Later, when the Kingdom of Zeal further tries to tap into Lavos' power, he awakens to destroy them, setting humanity's progress back thousands of years. All this is a warm-up to the final devastation Lavos inflicts in 1999 that dooms humanity to a slow extinction in a cold wasteland. The Color has a more localized effect, but mutates and corrupts all life near the farm, leaving behind a blasted heath where nothing grows. It must, I thought as I viewed it, be the outcome of a fire, but why had nothing new ever grown over those 5 acres of grey desolation that sprawled open to the sky like a great spot eaten by acid in the woods and fields? There was no vegetation of any kind on that broad expanse, but only a fine grey dust or ash which no wind seemed to ever blow about. The trees near it were sickly and stunted, and many dead trunks stood or lay, rotting at the rim. The Color, or what we assume to be its spawn, shoots out of the well and into the sky at the climax of the tale. Lavos' spawn will one day do the same, leaving Earth to go to other planets. There are differences between the entities, of course. The timescales are vastly different. Lavos takes 65 million years for his cycle, compared to the Color's year and a half. The scope of destruction is also a contrast of magnitudes. The blasted heath has spread to about 5 acres at the time of the present in the story. Lavos destroys an entire planet. Still, they each treat the Earth as nothing more than a spawning ground, and its life forms a means to an end. It's this difference in timescale that brings Cthulhu to mind. Lavos and Cthulhu have each been dormant a very long time. For Lavos, 65 million years. For Cthulhu, quote, "After vigintillions of years, great Cthulhu was loose again, and ravening for delight." Consider these as well. Lavos sleeps deep underground. In his house at R'lyeh, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Cthulhu in his dreams manages to create and maintain a cult of followers devoted to worship and who work towards returning their god to its proper place, with the belief he will reward them. Lavos is not so influential over the population of Earth, but does have a cult of one, and it's a pretty important one, Queen Zeal. Quote, "Seems the more energy the Mammon machine absorbs, the further the queen descends into madness. Lavos is overtaking her soul from within his slumber beneath the waves." What does she want? Just the simple stuff, immortality and power. Unlike the rest of her kingdom, Queen Zeal is not destroyed, but seemingly gets exactly what she wants from Lavos. Not only is she incredibly powerful, being one of the top-tier bosses of the endgame, but she also appears ageless across the possible time periods you can fight her. Who else had a cult with immortal leaders? That's right, Cthulhu. The Call of Cthulhu repeatedly mentions the undying or deathless leaders of Cthulhu's cult in the mountains of China. Queen Zeal is effectively the high priestess of Lavos' cult. And according to a translation comparison on the Chrono Compendium, Zeal refers to herself in the Japanese version with a rare, humble female form of I, which can also mean concubine. She is the servant, Lavos is the master. There are two big differences between Cthulhu and Lavos that make me favor the color out of space for the closest Lovecraftian relative. Let's get some description of Cthulhu and his spawn. Quote, "They were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had a shape, but that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky, but when they were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of R'lyeh, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu for a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them." This tells us two things. Cthulhu is not sleeping because he wants to. Cthulhu is involuntarily inactive, unlike Lavos, who is carrying out his business unimpeded. Further, Cthulhu is not made of normal matter. The desperate boat crew in the Call of Cthulhu ram their ship into Cthulhu, who bursts with a pop, but begins to reform as the ship flees. Lavos, though powerful, is made of ordinary matter, and can be literally beaten to death with a mop if a player so chooses. Perhaps you're wondering, isn't the color out of space also made from some pretty exotic stuff? This is correct. Both the color itself and the nature of the meteorite it lands with are very different from normal Earth matter. This brings us to the final Lovecraftian parallel to Lavos we'll be discussing today, the Elder Things from At the Mountains of Madness. How so? They arrived from space like Cthulhu and the color. Unlike those two, but like Lavos, the Elder Things are tough, seemingly ageless, and made from ordinary matter. But the real kicker is that the Elder Things were masters of creating life forms. Much of the life on Earth, human life specifically, was created by the Elder Things as either a mistake or a joke. In Chrono Trigger's sequel, Chrono Cross, something called the Frozen Flame started an evolutionary change in humans to allow them to become magic users. The Frozen Flame originates from Lavos. There are conflicting theories on whether this was intentional on Lavos' part or not, just like Lovecraft's humans and the Elder Things. But that's enough about Lavos already. What other Lovecraftian tentacles can we find slithering inside this game? Well, Lovecraft founded the literary movement of cosmicism. Briefly, this means humanity is utterly insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe. People are weak, temporary, and can do nothing to make a change in the vast, unknowable universe. The players of Chrono Trigger get a similar message should they fail in their mission to stop Lavos. But the future refused to change. Even with a time machine and foreknowledge, mankind cannot avoid its fate, at least until you reload the game. The fact that the protagonists can succeed pushed this into the so-called Lovecraft Light territory. It is worth noting that the good guys do sometimes win in Lovecraft stories, notably the Dunwich Horror, and I would argue the case of Charles Dexter Ward. Another shared thematic element is the idea of prehistoric civilizations, both human and non-human. Chrono Trigger has, in 65 million BC, an advanced civilization of reptiles fighting for control of the planet with early humans. Lovecraft had a few non-human civilizations in his own works. There are crocodile men from the Nameless City. There are the green-skinned gelatinous beings of Ib from The Doom That Came to Sarnath. And let's not forget the non-humanoid civilizations, including the Yithians and the Elder Things. We can find a great cross-comparison between the Lost Kingdom of Zeal and the humanoid-looking but actually anciently extraterrestrial beings from the Lovecraft and Zelia Bishop collaboration, The Mound. Both civilizations are technologically and magically advanced. Both are in a state of moral decay. The people of the Mound have been at it for thousands of years, so their moral decadence is much further along than that of Zeal, who's only been at it for a generation or two at most. Both have beings they consider lesser in value. The humans in 1200 BC in Chrono Trigger are divided between the magic users, who live in the Kingdom of Zeal, and the non-magic users, who are forced to live on the surface of the planet. The Earthbound ones are being allowed to work on the construction of the palace, so they do have a purpose after all. The people of Kenyan have a race of genetically engineered subhumans and reanimated slaves to do the heavy lifting of civilized life for them. Both are sliding into hedonism. Zeal is pretty mild in this regard, but they are content to sleep days away and otherwise enjoy a cushy life while others toil below on the surface of the planet. After all, how much wanton hedonism are you really going to fit into an ESRB-rated K through A title? The people of the Mound are much worse. Quote, daily life was organized in ceremonial patterns, with games, intoxication, torture of slaves, daydreaming, gastronomic and emotional orgies, religious exercises, exotic experiments, artistic and philosophical discussions, and the like, as the principal occupations. Quote, art and intellect, it appeared, had reached very high levels in Sath, but had become listless and decadent. Kenyan also had their own struggle with an older reptile civilization they conquered, the beings of Yath, who they crossbred into their slave population. Additionally, Zeal forms a kind of Atlantis myth, the advanced but proud civilization that suffers a catastrophic collapse. Atlantis is explicitly mentioned in Lovecraft's revision work, The Last Test, and Medusa's Coil. Lovecraft was quite fond of the lost and destroyed ancient precursor civilization motif. He even worked in the Pacific Ocean equivalent of Atlantis, the continent of Mu, into his revision work Out of the Aeons. In Chrono Trigger, there comes a moment where the player characters are talking about their adventures, and the topic of how and why the time gates exist comes up. Robo concludes some entity has been directing the party through time and space, presumably with the ultimate goal of stopping Lavos. Based on this, and a line from the Japanese version of the game saying, "This is a battle between the planet and Lavos," we may infer that the planet, or its spirit in fact, has some agency and is using Chrono and his allies in defense of its favored inhabitants. Sound familiar? It won't, unless you've read H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Street. The relevant point can be conveyed by quoting the opening line, "There be those who say that things and places have souls, and there be those who say they have not. I dare not say myself, but I will tell of the street." Essentially, an old-timey, all-American New England street has enough consciousness and agency to collapse some old houses on top of presumably Bolshevik terrorists who hate America, and are actively planning a campaign of destruction. The entity creates time gates, allowing Chrono and his friends to kill Lavos and stop the extinction of life on Earth. Let's briefly talk about dreams. Zeal, and its PG hedonism, has taken to frequent dreaming. Quote, "We find truth in the bliss of sleep," and "truth exists in dreams." If Lovecraft were a subject in the Kingdom of Zeal, he would fit right in. Many of his stories involve dreaming, and some occur in a place explicitly called the Dreamlands. Dreams were both a subject and an inspiration for his stories. Lovecraft doesn't use time travel like Chrono Trigger uses time travel, namely to alter the future for the better, but it does come up. Examples include the body swapping across time and space in The Shadow Out of Time, a cosplaying time wizard in the story He, whatever time loop shenanigans are happening in The Silver Key, and the other consciousness swap through time and space in Through the Gates of the Silver Key. Finally, I will mention a story that involves a time machine, if ever so tangentially, The Battle That Ended the Century, the subtitle, Manuscript Found in a Time Machine. Lovecraft even has his hand in some post-apocalyptic works as well. The very short story Memory, and the collaboration with R.H. Barlow, Till o' the Seas. Let's talk about player characters. And if we are talking about Lovecraftian protagonists, that means no females, no silent characters, and no robots. Frogmen, though? Glenn, or as you know him through most of the game, Frog, is, well, a frogman. There are times when men are transformed in Lovecraft's tales. The Moonbog features dozens of people transformed by an angry bog spirit into frogs. The Zelia Bishop Lovecraft collaboration, The Curse of Yig, merits a mention too, though the comparison is a bit messy. What's also messy? Human-animal hybrids not produced by curses. This is obvious Lovecraft territory, with the fish-frog men from The Shadow over Innsmouth. There's also the monkey business happening in the story, The Facts Concerning the Late Arthur German and His Family. What does this have to do with Chrono Trigger? Well, one of the harder-to-find endings alters the timeline, so that the brave knight Frog ends up marrying into the royal line, resulting in some interesting characteristics and some Lovecraftian horror for the princess. Something else about Frog that's noticeable is that in the original US release, his English was made into ye olde English, peppered with these and thous. It's old-timey, but even in the medieval period, no one else is talking in such an antiquated manner. So either the curse that transformed him into a frog makes him speak that way, or he just does it because he likes it. Who else spoke and wrote archaically? Lovecraft. He favored spellings and pronunciations of English rather than American origin, with a flair for archaism as well. Finally, does this description of the young Prince Janus sound familiar? A, quote, sullen lad dispensing macabre lines who has an insane mother and a love of cats? Hint, hint. I've gone on long enough. The various parallels, real or imagined, exist, and I hope you've enjoyed learning about them. Did I leave something out? Was there an oversight or a mistake? Leave a comment. Interested in Lovecraftian elements of a different game? Leave a comment on what you'd like to see covered. Please take a moment to like this video if you did, and subscribe if you'd like to see more. And by the way, if you're looking for a little more Lovecraft-tinted entertainment in your life, may I suggest my own work of fiction, The Weaver and Other Stories, available on Amazon? Give it a go. 3 novelettes for $3. Thanks for watching, and catch you next time. The creature was immense, far bigger than any life form has a right to be. Its outer shell resembled a jagged mountain more than any carapace I'd ever seen. But then from its beak came a cacophony of rumbles and wailing that even now rattles my brain and resonates in my trembling hands. How I did not die right there, I cannot say. I only know that I must have stumbled back to the time machine. It is the end of us all. All life, all paths of existence, everything will fall to the eldritch, gaping maw of Lavos.